You who teach others, do you not teach yourself? You who preach against stealing, do you steal? You who say people should not commit adultery, do you commit adultery? You who abhor idols, do you rob temples? Do you dishonor God by breaking the law? Those are not necessarily questions that Paul is looking for an answer for. He knows the answer. He wants them to think about it. God's name, he said, is being mocked because of God's people. But is that really any different today? And I would say no. I would say that God's people are still causing God to be mocked. I think that's why so many people automatically, without even thinking about it, reject the good news. They say, well, you know, these people call themselves Christians and they act like this. I don't want any part of that. Well, me neither. At least the people that are down at the bar, unless they're showing up for church the next morning, are honest, you know. Now, if they're down there and show up for church the next morning, that's hypocritical. But we need to understand that we have a responsibility because of what God has entrusted to us. And that was the same for the Jews. We often use our own self-confidence or our confidence in our religious traditions or beliefs or rituals or whatever they might be to set ourselves apart and say that we have some type of exemption from God's judgment. Paul is saying, God gave you all the law, you who are Jews. He entrusted you with the very wisdom of himself. And you're using that as an excuse to say that God is going to just give you a pass. He says it's not true. The law is not going to do you any good if you ignore it. And then in verses 25 through 29, he talks about another thing that the Jews said. Well, okay, you say the law doesn't do us any good, but what about circumcision? Verse 25, circumcision has value if you observe the law. But if you break the law, you have become as though you had not been circumcised. If those who are not circumcised keep the law's requirement, will they not be regarded as though they were circumcised? The one who is not circumcised physically and yet obeys the law will condemn you. Oh, will condemn you who, even though you have the written code in circumcision, are a lawbreaker. A man is not a Jew if he is only one outwardly, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. No, a man is a Jew if he is one inwardly. And circumcision is circumcision of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the written code. Such a man's praise is not from men, but from God. Circumcision is not a substitute for obedience. Now, we need to go back and understand the rite or the ritual of circumcision. That was given by God to Abraham. If you need to read about it, begin in Genesis chapter 12 and continue through chapter 17. That whole area you'll pick up where God made his covenant with Abraham and then gave him that as a sign that he was special. But if you'll remember, the covenant he made with Abraham was that I'm going to bless you. I'll bless those who bless you, but through you, all the people of the world will be blessed. And so he had a responsibility not just to keep the blessings to himself, but to be a channel through which God's blessings could flow. Circumcision was given as a symbol of a special relationship with God. We don't see it that way anymore, but that is the background to it. You see, circumcision constituted not a substitute for obedience, but rather a commitment to obedience. In verses 25 and 26, he says, if we were to look at it in a mathematical equation, circumcision minus obedience equals uncircumcision. And on the other hand, he says, uncircumcision plus obedience equals circumcision. It's sometimes a difficult argument to follow, but Paul is using a very logical argument that Jews would have understood and would not have liked, because he's striking at the very heart of what they held as their self-confidence of who they were, and because of that, God would treat them special. Now, I want you to hear me carefully. This is not salvation by obedience. We're not talking about salvation. We're talking about judgment. They're two totally different things. This is not salvation by obedience, but obedience as the evidence of salvation. In other words, when we know Christ as Savior, when He has transformed our lives, then it should change our wants, our motivations, the things that we hold important. And because of that, because He loved us first, because He provided salvation for us, then we obey in response to that. We sang that song, Trust and Obey. And if you'll remember last week, we talked about how faith and obedience go together like love and marriage. You can't have one without the other. But obedience does not produce faith. Faith produces obedience. We have to get it in the right order. So the Jews were saying, well, we've been circumcised, therefore we'll be okay. Paul says, no, you've got it backwards. Even those who have not been circumcised, if they obey the law, will show that they are the true Jews. So, in verse 28, he tells us what a Jew is not. Not one outwardly, nor is circumcision merely outward and physical. And then in verse 29, he tells us what a true Jew is. He's one inwardly. Circumcision is circumcision of the heart, by the Spirit, not by the written code. Circumcision of the heart replaces the physical rite. In the New Testament, as Paul was preaching, he would often refer to people as uncircumcised of heart. And we need to have that inward change, not an outward change. The outward change may follow as a result of the inner change, but that is not what we should focus on. It replaces the outward rite. It doesn't merely complement it. And he says it's by the Spirit, not by the written code. It's God's Spirit that transforms us. It's God's Spirit that gives us life. It's God's Spirit that brings us into that life eternal, more abundant that Jesus said He came to give. It's by the Spirit, not by outward rituals. It's basically the Old Covenant versus the New. The Old Covenant did include the law. It included circumcision. The New Covenant, by grace. It's a covenant of grace. And so Paul says, really, that is irrelevant whether you're circumcised or not. What matters is the evidence in your life of a transformation by the Spirit of God. Now, we can translate this into our day if we talk about Christians and baptism especially. Laura read that passage from 1 Corinthians a while ago, and obviously Paul was not a Baptist, because he said, well, I baptized the household of Stephanus and Gaius, so yeah, I baptized this household. I don't remember if I baptized anybody else or not. Well, I'll guarantee you, if he were a Baptist, he would have been writing it down and sending it into the convention. So, we often take that ritual of baptism and say, oh, I was baptized at such and such church when I was 8 years old. Okay, fine.